session in this second version of the training cycles under the LACPASS PAHO-DDCC project. So I want to welcome everybody. And after a brief vacation period, we're back full of power to continue with the work that we have prepared for the coming months. So just a little bit of context just for you to remember that we have simultaneous interpretation enabled if you require it. We are then in this convergence of initiatives associated to cross-border interoperability, the certificates. My name, by the way, is Carlos Núñez. I forgot to say my name, and I'm in charge of coordinating the LACPASS initiative. So this is the context in general, bringing together the different efforts, the different resources for these three initiatives. And this is the map of the current region, where we have several countries that are participating in one or more than one of these initiatives. Our focus and the spirit behind this is to make sure that all the countries can participate in these initiatives, because there are different enablers and deliverables that in the coming months will be available for each of the different projects. And this is already working as one big, large project. And this is translated into this, onto this slide, which is one way of showing you the map or the mind plan, the mind map for the enablers that we are developing and that will continue being developed under this project. The idea is just to give one full bundle, one full file, so as to speak, that will allow us to install all of these enablers that are being built by modules, and the different countries will have the possibilities of selecting which parts to implement and which not. And this is a full delivery nonetheless for the region, what we have called the country node. And we are providing then these enablers that will allow to use the international patient summary profile and also the extension in order to have the appropriate or corresponding COVID certificate according to the DDCC standard by the WHO, and also a central node that will allow to work with the different subsets defines profiles, and it's under a different standard. This is what we will be looking at in the coming meetings. And well, some of the new things that come up that we will be correspondingly mentioning in the coming meetings, and it's part of the way that we're going to be delivering all of these tools, but we'll share that in other sessions. So this is the second version. We shifted 1 week here. We started in February. We are here on February the 23rd. Fernando Portilla will be leading these. He's the senior advisor from the IDB and an expert in interoperability. So without much else to add, I will hand it over to Fernando. This is just a general information. If there is any country that is not participating in all the initiatives but still wants to join some of them, this is the contact information and we can start managing the request. Fernando, the floor is all yours. Go ahead. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for that introduction. Let us then talk a little bit about IPS in action. In the previous semester, we had seen an introduction to this standard, and just as Carlos was saying, this standard, and we will be seeing this throughout the presentation, this is a standard that is being referenced quite a bit at the interoperability project level in many different places. And it's useful for interoperability-related topics, cross-border interoperability, but also for interoperability within the countries. So the purpose then of today's presentation is just to tell you briefly what it's about. Most likely, many of you manage the basic information, but I want to share with you also how we're moving towards the FIRE standard, and also to share with you some experiences, some from the region, and some basic tools also, because I think, and probably Carlos and Sonia might say this, there will most likely be more technical and more specific sessions dedicated to this standard. There are many tools, there are many different views and validators and servers that can be used with this standard. So most likely, we're not going to be seeing many of those in detail today. We're just going to look at the origins, its main components, and we're going to see how it maps against FIRE. And then we're going to be looking at some experiences. That's all I wanted to say, really. IPS then is one of the standards that we're going to be using in the Connectathon with some of the groups also in the LACPASS component for interoperability topics. So the idea is that we are all well informed, or well aware, and to see how it is set up, where it comes from, and what it's used for. There are some things that have not yet been very deeply designed or implemented, but I think it's important that as the government teams that you are to get involved with this standard in your work, because the experiences that are created from here on will only add to the implementation. So where does this all come from? And how is FIRE using it? What are some of the experiences? We're not really be doing hands-on. We're only going to be looking at a couple of tools to try and understand it within the or to understand it as an HL7 message, so that we can have a general view. And also then I'll share with you a couple of experiences and then what it is that we are expecting, at least at a high level, within the regional public good. So these are the big topics that we will be addressing in this presentation today. So it is good to understand the genesis, to understand where these all came from, because it is an important need that, and this is something that has been discussed in several projects. One of the most important ones is the EPSOS project. This was a project that, in which the European Union countries started talking about the need of that the population, the citizens in the member states, given the high mobility levels, could have a kind of a medical summary that could be consulted within the different countries, but also to provide the necessary support for processes like medical prescriptions. So if a patient has a prescription in a given country, well, for them to be able to use that in another country within the EU. So these are the big use cases, a prescription and a patient summary. This cross-border, that's what this EPSOS project was about. And this meant trying to define the data in the summary, the data that had to be present in the prescription. This was a pilot, and it was a tryout and experience to test some of the components that were being developed with IHE. They developed this with CDAs, with HL7 version 3. So trying to access repositories. And this gave some results. Some countries were able to do this, and it worked well for them. And from then on, we can talk about some of the things that have happened. But in general, what I want to say is that there is a big motivation behind all of this, and that is, what is the minimum exchange data? What is the minimum data set that can be exchanged? That's it, really. That's the big question mark. What is the data? Which is the data that can be exchanged? So EPSIS started this first approach. And then, on the other hand, Spain took on this project in 2010. And these documents are published in the Spanish POE, and it's the consensus of the minimum data set. And it mentions, although document H says a summarized clinical record. So these were concepts that were beginning to come up in the different countries. A summary, although there are specific documents for the different types of medical events, laboratory, images, medical consultations, it's just one specific summary. And we can also see here at the bottom, more or less how this is being used. The types of use that it has in the different locations within Spain. So HCR is precisely the electronic or summarized clinical record. And this is the type of document that's being used in these particular communities or areas. So this is part of the experience. This is on top of what was happening with EPSIS. So the technical teams started moving forward, and there's all the complexity, you know, the different members, the different languages involved. It's one large continent, and this was all being discussed. But an interesting governance came up in Europe as part of the European Commission, and they started working on this. And this is a document that's also available, by the way, and it's important for you to maybe take a look at it. They started talking about then electronic healthcare and the need to share clinical patients, clinical data. And they started looking at some of the regulatory frameworks. So the chapter 14, which talks about the cooperation and the exchange of information between the member states, this is a voluntary network, and it starts talking about then the summary health care records. So the results came up, and the European Parliament gets the support from an open organization that starts working with these results, and we are going to see immediately what happened with this. So this is on the European side. Now, the Americans on their end were also working in trying to put together a summary. And one of the first ones that is known is the CCR, Continuity Care Record. And it's maybe more private as the American healthcare system is. People that are part of the different healthcare organizations, but they created this standard called CCR. ASTM is a standard organization. And what you can see here on the right-hand side is one of the versions of the CCR from this organization called ASTM. And this is what the information that would be important in a patient summary. We can see at the top that they talk about the document identification information, the patient's information, diagnosis, medications, all of those different sections that you can see. So the work that was carried out by ASTM also meant that, well, HL7, by the way, was also working with the CDA standard. This is back in the year 2000. CDA came up in with HL7, and we have a standard then that is specific for these exchanging of documents. ASTM then and HL7, two standard organizations got together and they created the CCD. The CCD is the same CCR mentioned before, but in the CDA version. And this is interesting because that is part of the evolution of the patient's summary, and with the minimum data set for exchange of information. President Obama thought that these exchange tests were very interesting, this whole continuity care document. But as a summary, they defined that it was important to include other additional documents. And those documents started being standardized in a specification called CCDA. So it includes CCCD, which we already know where it comes from. It's part of the ASTM and CDA, and it includes additional documents. But we could see them within the specifications, within, CCD, what they were doing in Europe and back to EPSUS, that there were similar sections, allergies, medications, and other types of problems. So at some point in time, the American groups, with these results, some of the people that had also worked in EPSUS, they started saying, why don't we integrate then these two projects? And there was an experience which took a couple of years, which is called Trillium, trying to bring together the two experiences from the two different continents. And it was included to the work that the network was carrying out, the e-health network was doing out. So with ISO, then the standard was being created, which was called the IPS, International Patient Summary. It is a standard that has an ISO specification, and then the technical teams from HL7 created the specification for CDA, but also for FHIR. So this is just to tell you where this whole thing comes from. It did not start, I mean, it goes back a few years, but these is its evolution, and these technical teams, some from EPSUS, some from Trillium, some from the American experience. It means that nowadays we are lucky enough to have a standard that has undergone many different types of validations and brushing up. And that means that we have received something that is very well adapted to what we're looking for right now, which is exchanging the information, obviously with security, because none of the countries really participated as part of these I mean, none of the countries from our region participated in any of the discussions and the development. And it's only now that we are having an important presence in the use, in the adoption of this standard. And we can see then different references that will provide us a lot of support, but we're also going to find some points where we will need additional supplementation. So the International Patient Summary, IPS, out of all of these sections, or all of these discussions, all of the reviews that were developed in time, when you look at the authors that participated, we feel that, well, we can see that some of them were in the national projects, Kaiser in the United States, in Spain, in EPSIS, and they started coming down to this agreement. So if a patient required a cross-border healthcare service, which is the minimum data set that a physician should have access to in order to know the different types of health care situations that can help to avoid risks are present. So I think that in summary, this is very interesting. It's a minimum, not exhaustive data set of clinical data, regardless of the speciality and the condition, but easily used by all clinicians. So they have been categorized then as the exceptions, we could say. There's some data that could be considered context and then separate sections, and the different sections have been characterized according to the different levels of criticality. And what we're going to be looking into is what are the sections that exist and what are the considerations, and then we can see then how this starts mapping out to the fire resources. And that is the exercise precisely that we have been looking at with the technical teams, how to create an IPS of our own from our own different countries for our patients. And with the LACPASS project, then how can we create a next connectathon? So safety, security-related topics, for example, is one of the things that we need to look into, and that is not covered by IPS. IPS is only the minimum data set. So that's a contribution on that end. What is the data that can be shared? But we're also then going to have that discussion on how. How do we share that? What are the security levels? Is there going to be one repository? What is the type of patient identifier that will be used? So many additional things that are on the side, or on the top, on the bottom, or somehow linked to this minimum data set. So what I'm trying to say is that this does not solve everything. It does help when it comes to the consensus of the minimum data set. So this is, in summary, the consensus of the minimum data set. From left to right, it begins by specifying what's the data. For those who are not acquainted with this, or with CDA, or with a clinical document, on the left-hand side, it basically talks about the header. And this is the context, the general context information. Since it's an electronic document, the APS contains this data, who is the patient, subject, the author who created the document, the physician creating that document, who validates it, certifier, and who is the custodian, where is it stored. From there on, we have a certain different levels of information, going from more criticality to the lowest criticality. So what the standard recommends are these three sections. We first have red. This is required, mandatory. If a patient is cared for in another patient, we should have the medication summary, the allergies, intolerances, and other problems that they may have. The purpose of this is that with these required data sets in red, this is the minimum information required in order to reduce risk and to provide the continuity of the patient care, because we know the type of medication that the patient has, we know the type of medication that they have being prescribed, the different allergies to substances or medication, which can help in decreasing the possibility of having an adverse reaction. And this could help in the case of a diagnosis and when defining the treatment that a doctor in a different country can provide. So in summary, this is for the clinical record and the continuity of the healthcare, which is precisely this, just a moment of truth, so as to speak, when a physician and patient get together, but they do not know each other, and they need to have this critical information. And then we could have some analytical processes and secondary uses of the IPS, but that is later on. It also has to go hand in hand with an informed consent, and the standard is not really about that. It's basically what are the required mandatory data, and then some of the recommended data. That's that third column in green. It is important to know their vaccination records, immunization, the type of surgical procedures that they have undergone. It's important if they've had heart surgery, medical devices, where there is, for example, a pacemaker or any other type of device, I don't know, for knee surgery or the hip surgery. Also a result or diagnosis, lab information that could be key, for example. So this is what we call diagnosis. These are recommended and important. And then the last one is optional, but that they can still be key. Vital signs, previous disease history, pregnancy, social history, functional state, a care plan, and advanced guidelines. So this is a very high-level overview of the components of the IPS. And this was agreed upon at a conceptual level, but the advantage is that there is a specification at two standard levels, two different, or rather two versions of the HL7 standard, CDA version and the FIRE version. This is basically just to tell you that the first part is the model, the model of the information. That's what you can see on this slide. Conceptually, it must contain all of this. This is what we have just been talking about, given all of that history that I shared with you at the beginning. But when it comes to the implementation, then we can see that both in CDA as well as in FIRE, there are resources that have a mapping here. So we can see in CDA, CDA is a clinical document, and but by nature, it also it models this. It has the different sections with this information. That's what a CDA document includes. But in FIRE, we have resources, as they are called, or equivalent to these resources. They are called compositions in FIRE. And this is a resource with which to model clinical records, clinical documents. It has this information on the context, and different sections can be associated or linked to it. The type of document, the subject, this would be the patient, the author, the custodian, but also here at the bottom, we have other sections which can be from 0 to many. And a composition document can have different sections, and this is all well documented within the standard, and we're going to make a quick review of this, just a quick overview, but this is the way that it was thought of and how it has been put together. And then the interesting thing is that for the different sections, let's take a look at them. This is what was required: medications, allergies, and problems. And each one of them has a profile which is associated to a file resource. So medication, for example, not all of them, not all are resources. So medication, when we talk about the patient's medication, these could be the medications that are being requested, or the medication that the patient has taken, or the patient's or the medication that the patient has been prescribed, and it has different types of modeling. So on the right hand side, we don't always model according to just one unique resource. We have a section, and we can have more than one resources related to it. So in the medication summary, if this patient has a prescription, that would be then the medication request, or these medication have been administered to the patient, that would be the medication statements, and so on and so forth. In the case of allergies and intolerances, yes, there's only one resource, and that is called allergy intolerance. With that resource, we can do the profiling for the standard, and that is the one that is used within this summary. In the case of problems, well, clinical conditions that are being controlled, and it's really closely related to diagnosis. And there's one specific resource for problems and diagnosis, which in FHIR, it's called condition. So remember, on the right-hand side in blue, this is what we have as a resource in FHIR. And what we have in parentheses is because they have been specifically profiled for the standard. So the resources were taken at the basis, and then they were adjusted for these particular sections of the standard. These are the mandatory ones, recommended ones. Well, again, here we have immunizations, that is to say vaccines, current state, and the patient vaccination history. And there's a resource there called immunization. And this is very, very interesting, because with that resource, most likely now with the DDCC exercises and the exercises that we're going to be carrying out with PAHO, we're most likely going to be using this resource quite a lot. There we have all of the possibilities for modeling a vaccination event. And one of the challenges is, after having an IPS standard, how can we create a certificate for different vaccinations, or how far can we actually go with that? But the vaccination data can be modeled then with a section that is part of the IPS standard. The same thing with the procedures. Invasive diagnosis, therapeutical, surgical procedures, or maybe just therapies, dialysis, to mention one. And then the FHIR resources related to these procedures is, well, the first one, procedure, also organization to see where the procedure took place, and also device in the case that there is a specific or particular device involved. Medical devices, and there's also a specific section for that, where you can code the different types of medical devices that are being used by the patient. In some cases, it may be important to consider that the patient has a pacemaker, or some kind of prosthetics, or any other type of device that could be important when considering the surgical procedures or outpatient procedures. And this is quite a versatile section because the last one, sorry, the results and diagnosis, because there we can include laboratory resources, also images and different reports, clinical reports. So there is a section where the main resource we can see different results. We see that in FHIR in observations, but there could be PDF documents, images, and this section can then use these different results. Other sections, this is under options, vital signs, for example. This could be data from a personal health device, for example, this monitoring information, for example, a patient that is being monitored at home, and we can have the information on, I don't know, weight, size, temperature, heart rate, and others, vital signs. And there's not one resource actually called vital signs. Vital signs is really a profile. It's a profile that is a part of observations. We can confirm that though, but I'm almost sure it's a profile that comes from the resource called observation. Well, the history of previous diseases, the conditions and diagnosis of the patient is called a condition. Also, information related to the pregnancy. This is the third one. Here we can have the resource called observation, which is key for the results, for patient's information, you know, from lab information all the way to genomic data. It's very, very, very important. It's key. Social history, for example, that's also within observation, functional state, care plan, and advanced guidelines. So this, at a very high level again, is a summary. So let me just give you a quick overview. Well, as with all the specifications in FHIR, everything's open. So let's go there. And this is precisely what we have been talking about. So what you can see is the different sections. And here in the IPS, we have the structure. Here at the bottom, under IPS, you can see precisely what we have just looked at. If there's something that's not clear, you can go into here, you can take a look at this. And we have the different sections, medications, allergies, all of the descriptions that I have given you is here in detail. It explains what each of these sections is. And here at the bottom, this is what I have shown you. Each of the different sections, conceptually speaking, what it's about, but it also tells you the resource associated to it. So medications could be any of these three. Allergies is this one. All of this then mapped, IPS mapped to the FHIR resources. So some of them have been adapted, for example, here. from the original resource, which is conditions, it is profiled and adapted, and these recommended, mandatory, or optional data, and also the necessary metadata associated. So here for the codification, they are recommending the binding. This is, for example, the SNOMED code. For diagnosis, we can use SNOMED to use that in the IPS specification. This is vital signs, for example. This is the differentiation table. It's an observation because it's a result, vital signs is. There's no FHIR resource called vital signs. It is under observation. So the resource or the vital signs are under observations. So basically, this is just to tell you about the specification, which is here, and at the conceptual level, what we can see here, and then the mapping against the FHIR resource. Next part, then. Let me go back to my presentation. So what's happening with this? What's going on with this? What are some of the experiences worldwide? Well, there are different things that are being inspired by this standard. It's more or less being agreed. It has a logic. It's mapped against FHIR. There's a CDA version also. There's a recommendation. And if it's too complex to agree within the country, what is the minimum data set? Well, here we already have a good consensus, at least a summary, and this could maybe be a good starting point, so as not to start from absolute scratch. This is a guideline that can guide us precisely on how to move forward. So we're going to be looking at some experiences, not in detail, but I do want to share some that are good so that we can keep them in mind and we can use them as a reference. And this standard has an interesting reference. So why not? This site right here, I apologize, but yeah, this site summarizes some of the experiences around the world. What they're actually doing. Some experiences then. And the interesting thing is that we can see that we're talking about the same thing: medications and allergies. So this is the standard organizations, for example, CEN, and ISO, and well, CEN and ISO are aligning their work, and HL72 SNOMED with the coding. WHO also says let's create or let's integrate the vaccination certificate. So this site is actually very good. And here, across the globe, I think this is what I wanted to share with you. Some of the implementations that have taken place around the globe. And it's good to take a look at these and to surf through this to see, for example, what the Canadians did. This is a connect-a-thon or a project-a-thon. And The different provinces, the different state departments were doing this. And the same thing happens. It's not always easy to consolidate. So they started with these minimum consensus. And here you can then read about the Canadian experience. There are different PDF documents, and it tells you all about it. And it ends up with how this was all defined. Not everything is mandatory, but we have here the whole experience of the Connectathon. You can see the PDF, right? So here on the left, they have their mapping. So this is the Canadian IPS. They have here what's in yellow. And it's actually quite flexible. The country decided that they were not going to commit to some of the recommended, but only to those that were mandatory. But at least they have these as a reference. And
entonces, bueno, entonces allí esa experiencia los canadienses interesante.
So this is the Canadian experience, which was very interesting. Well, also in the United Kingdom, in Argentina, they you know that it was difficult to come to agreement, but IPS had the standard, and this was the basis for the digital health project in Argentina, and it has different levels of progress, but the basis is the IPS. One around here, which I believe is very interesting, is this particular one, the Global Digital Health Partnership. If I'm not mistaken, this is the HL7 group. Yes, this is it. It's interesting. The Global Digital Health Partnership, GDHP, and it's a group of countries that put together the project to start developing interoperability based on this standard. And there are different countries in the region. We can see Argentina, Uruguay, Mexico also, well, Chile. So this is very interesting. So that site is helpful then for you to take a look at different experiences. And then the last one, because we're coming to an end, the last thing here then is that I want to share with you is to talk about a couple of additional experiences. One very close by, we can share this case, is the case of Colombia. Colombia put together a specification, a standard, because they required a standardized representation, and Colombia has this standard, Resolution 866, where the exchanging data that the data that can be exchanged is under this standard, and it was necessary to put together the model, the exchange model. And this was now at a regulatory level, but they required then the specification or standardized exchange. So using IPS then, Colombia created the digital care summary. The first version includes all of these sections: patient, medications, allergy, and diagnosis. And around that, then last year they carried out a connectathon. They were looking only at one of the sections, at diagnosis, and this allowed for the validation of the very first connectathon. So this is an implementation guide, and this is the RDA in Colombia. This is the guide, the profiles, and basically this RDA has a composition and has some sections, medications, allergies, and diagnosis. And this is all part of one bundle, because what's actually exchanged is a document type bundle, which is what an IPS is. When you look at the example, they are compositions, but in order to be able to view them and to deploy them, they are in the doc bundle. And that's what's being used then as a guide for the countries, so that then the specifications can be done. Then the last thing that we can take a look at is precisely the expectations of what's coming.
Con los equipos de bien público, porque con la información estandarizada, entonces luego
With the standardized information, then we can start working on the viewers, on the validators, and other topics. So what we have here is just what you have there in that link that I have sent you is just a viewer. And you know that what you see there is the exchange message. And then we can take advantage of that by using an interface, any interface really, so that you can view it. And these are the challenges that are coming ahead of us. How are we going to view the information? This is just an example. This is a bundle. And we have, well, the composition and the different sections. So I can click here, view IPS, and it shows the data that we have for this patient. The name, date of birth, the allergies, diagnosis, medication, some results. This is work that they put together in a connectathon. And Alejandro gave this to us. And also Fernando Campos. The next step is precisely this then. Once we have this, we need to make sure that the data are consistent. But after that, we need to see how we're going to view them, because that is also key for the healthcare professional. We also have here the example of, this is our repository. There was a connectathon at the beginning of the year, and that we have here some connectathon samples. So there's a whole amount of IPSs from different countries, from Argentina, Australia, Canada, the US, the UK. And this means that if you're interested, you can start looking at these type of data and seeing, taking a look at how they were implemented in the different countries. And now, in closing, just 2 more minutes. What are we going to do then? The countries in the regional public good have different initiatives. So we can see that this is an interesting opportunity in order to test some of the IPS. And that's precisely this second component in the public good, which goes hand in hand with the PAHO project. You can see that we have immunization and also in the public good, and also the project talk about using a fire standard. We want to reuse these components related to the standard, to the servers, the repositories, the validation libraries, etc., so that the countries can have a repository that will allow them to consolidate and to create IPSs and vaccination certificates. So these are the coming challenges that with the SENS PAHO team and with the ITP and the regional public good, we want to work on so that we can implement country nodes that have these components for validation and consolidation of the information in the DDCC and the EU DCC. So the challenge is how to use that standard then for interoperability and healthcare continuity, and then another separate line, which is for the generation of the vaccination certificates. And that's precisely what we want to do with the different countries, so that in the different countries, we can have the structure and we can develop then the knowledge in order to truly take advantage of the interoperability services. That is it, ladies and gentlemen. I've gone a couple of minutes over time, but I think that it was necessary to talk about all of these topics. Thank you so very much, Fernando, for your presentation. Maybe we have a couple of minutes for any doubts, any questions, if anybody has any. If there aren't any doubts, I just need to remind you that the material for this second round of training sessions is hosted in the same place where we have the material for the first version, the Raxel site. Courses. In courses, you go into the Moodle, and it's not necessary to log in. You can come in as a guest, and here you can find the 3 cycles. Here we have under the same structure, the materials under the same structure. We've only identified it as a repetition or the second version. These are the videos. The first 2 ones are already up. We do have the first one pending. The speaker has to send us the PowerPoint presentation. But since it's the same topics, we can see the information is there and we can compare this. Obviously, this one's still missing, and we're going to be having that material ready soon. This is just the additional information if anybody requires this. Betania, you have your hand up. Hello. Thank you for that presentation, Fernando. We do have a doubt. We have worked on patient summary, and we have a doubt here on where this should be all housed. And we wanted to know if there's any particular recommendation for these topics. We know that there are pros and cons for the institution to actually create this, that the institution that is the custodian of the patient information, because the information can be created at different points, but we know that there's a possibility of also creating them at the central level. And so we have been looking at the pros and cons of the different possibilities, and we just wanted to put that on the table to discuss this or to see if there's a recommendation that has already been made. It's actually more on the implementation side, but it's one of the things that we looked at last week.
Sí. Gracias, Beta. Claro, y como te decía, realmente en lo que es
Right. The standard, in the standard, that specification doesn't really exist.
se habla como ya del documento.
So they talk about the document that has been created to then consolidate it. And we were talking about the Colombian project having, because we know that the standard is going to allow for this, but if you have different summaries for patient summaries, how can you create that with? I mean, and yes, that's part of the discussion, and I understand because it's all sealed, stamped, and signed. But you know, we're going to be heading in that direction, and we're going to try and see how we can make this viable, because the standard will allow us to do that. We can look at the medication, and it's going to be very complex to have individual documents. And I think that you're also living that. It's good to have the documents, but it's also good to say, you know, if this person has 100 documents, then it's not that easy. So you can have an information or result bundle, which is in FHIR, and then that can be a lot more versatile. When looking at the regulation, then we can see, you know, because in the end, this is almost like a report. But it's good, yes, it is good to talk about this, because the standard is not there specifically there, but trying to have a consolidated one. But should we have that consolidated, or should we store it outside? But that's the good thing, that we're actually starting with this, so that we can see the different experiences that we have developed. Yeah, well, it would be interesting to see if there are any recommendations from the standard, but if not, the information is there. You know, it's a concern that we have. Yeah, I understand, and it's an important concern. Thank you. Anyone else? I think that we may have time for one additional one. But if not, then we can finish the session. There are no hands up. Well, if there were any additional doubts, that we remember that we have the Slack and we have emails, the traditional channels. May, you want to say something? I just wanted to thank Fernando. That's all. That's all. Thank you. Bye-bye. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Fernando, for that excellent presentation. So with this session then is adjourned. Remember that you can have the material in the Raxel site. We'll see you next week. We have a technical committee for the LACPASS people. We will be sharing that information. And I believe that on Thursday, we're going to have another meeting. We still have to send out that invitation, though. This is on the convergence. Thank you so much, and we will see you soon. Thank you.